Hi, Nagapriya. I just want to slightly correct something you said at the end there, Dhammamega. What I said was that the teacher has become the disciple, and the disciple has become the teacher. This is how it's been with myself and Nagapriya. So although I introduced you, Mark Nagapriya, to Shinran, which had a very big effect on you, as we'll probably hear, you've gone much, much further than me. You've delved into it much deeper. You've thought about it, well, very deeply. And it really comes across in this book. And what I've been saying to people when I talk about the book to them is that I bet you've never, ever read a Buddhist book like this one. I would be prepared to bet, if I was a betting man, which of course I'm not, but I would be prepared to bet that our listeners here and our viewers will not have read a book like this on Buddhism. And I hope that you'll find out why as we go through this. But let's start, Nagapriya, if we would, by with the title, because it's packed full of ideas or themes. The promise of a sacred world. So the first questions are, what's the promise? And what is the sacred world? And then the subtitle is Shinran's teachings on other powers. So then we've got Shinran, which is largely what the book is about, and other powers. So I think we need to sort of talk about those four things together before we go any further. So which one would you like to kick off with?
Well, I'd just like to begin by saying that I just want to express my gratitude to Windhorse Publications for publishing the book, and Dhammamega for showing interest in it and helping me to sort of take it through to publication. But also, I'd really like to thank you, Ratnaguna, for sparking off my initial interest in Shinran, which really kind of started a project that's well, borne fruits in this book, but it's been a project that's been kind of gestating for a very, very long time. So I really want to thank you for that, and also for being with me today to talk about it. And I would also like to thank Dayamati, who about 3 years ago undertook to study the collected works of Shinran with me over about 6 months. And really that was the stimulus for writing the book. So he's here with us as well. I really want to thank him. And I want to thank everyone who's here for coming and showing interest in the book. We've got people from various different countries, from Brazil, Mexico, Spain, the UK, New Zealand, maybe Venezuela, other places. And that's just fantastic. So anyway, I wanted to say that to begin with, Ratnaguna, but let's get onto the book. Let's start with the promise, if you like, because it's the first significant word. One of the reasons why I put the word promise into the title is I find promises very, very mysterious. What is a promise, we might ask, because a promise is something to do with something that's going to happen in the future. A promise concerns something that has not yet happened. And yet, when somebody promises you something, you have confidence that it is going to happen. So there's a way in which a promise, in my mind, closes the distance between the present and the future. And I'm very interested in how that functions. So in this case, first of all, we could say that promise is Amitabha or Amida's promise, or Amitabha or Amida's vows. And that promise essentially was to create a pure land, at least in terms of the Amitabha myth. The promise was to create a pure land in which all beings can be reborn simply by calling his name. At least that's how it turned out in Shinran's perspective. So the promise is this, the possibility of this pure land. In a way, now we're getting into the sacred world, aren't we, as well? But anyway, the promise is Amida's vow, or series of vows. As you know, there are 48 vows that appear in the larger Pure Land scripture, and they promise various different things. One of the vows that, or promises that I've got quite interested in recently, is that all beings will be born in the Pure Land with golden bodies.
Yes.
I'm really
Wonderful.
struck by that image of all beings being reborn in golden bodies. The way that I would understand that is there are no differences between people. They all have the same character or the same nature, which is an enlightened nature. But also the goldenness to me is like they become spiritualized, if you like, through their rebirth in the Pure Land. But often, more specifically, when we're talking about Amida's vow or the promise, we're specifically talking about the 18th vow that promises all beings rebirth in the Pure Land if they call upon Amida. So that's the promise.
Yes. Yeah, I love that about the Pure Land, that all beings in there are golden. And you said they're all similar, but also when I've got a massive, great painting of the Pure Land, and there were, I think, 24 bodhisattvas all sitting around Amitabha. They've all got golden bodies, but they're also very different from each other. They all have their own, they all look in different directions, but they all have their own kind of character as well. Now, you mentioned Amida, and I suppose we should tell our listeners what you're talking about, because it comes from the Sanskrit word Amitabha or Amitayas. We know there are two words for the same figure, don't we? Amitabha, infinite light, and Amitayas, infinite life. So infinite in space and time. And what I find interesting is in the Pure Land tradition, they just put it down into those three syllables, Amida or Amita in Chinese, which means infinite, boundless, which is it's almost like at the very heart of the Pure Land myth is boundlessness. And that's what we're kind of aiming at, isn't it?
And the interesting thing about something that is boundless or infinite is that it cannot be captured. So we're trying to engage with what Amida gestures towards, but we can't because the nature of perception, the nature of human categories, is to put things in within bounds. And what Amida is will always escape the concepts or categories or boundaries that we might want to use to make sense of what Amida is gesturing towards.
Yes. So a few words about the sacred world.
Yeah, well, the sacred world, so there's various different, or I had various different ideas behind the phrase sacred world. The most perhaps obvious and straightforward one is the phrase sacred world could be seen as a synonym for Pure Land. And so if we think about the Amida myth, well, the Amida myth appears to talk about another world that we may be reborn into after death, which is more ideal for awakening. So you could say that is the sacred world. But equally, in the book, I talk a lot about the sacred world not being separate from this world or not being separate from everyday awareness, but it being more like a dimension of our awareness that we can constantly open out into. And I very specifically use the word sacred. I'm not going to tell this whole story, but there's quite a lot about it in the concluding chapter. But one of my convictions is that we need to recuperate or reclaim a religious language for talking about Buddhism, because Buddhism gestures towards things that are not simply mundane, they're not simply secular, and I will use the word religious or sacred to talk about them. And so part of what the book is about is my attempt to try to construct a language to talk about Buddhism as a sacred tradition, not simply as a set of self-growth techniques or a set of tools that we can use just to feel calmer and more tranquil.
Yes, it's one of the big themes of your book, and I think that's one of the reasons why I say that I bet you haven't read a book quite like this. Of course, there are Buddhist books that are put in very religious terms, but because of the Pure Land tradition and Shinran in particular, in order to really get across what the whole myth is about, you have to re-sacralize Buddhism, if you like. You can only talk about it in religious terms. It doesn't make sense otherwise. And you would you you quote a number of theologians, and gosh, they have such good things to say, so much to say to us Buddhists too. A very underused resource. The last few years I've been reading some theologians as well, and of course the Christian religion is very different from the Buddhist religion, but there are definite similarities and parallels, and one of them being the hierarchical world, in a way that in the book you talk about how our world is kind of flattened out. There's no higher kind of values, no transcendence, I suppose. And this is what I think you do really brilliantly. You bring in a theologian, and just a small quote perhaps, and then you show how relevant that is to our own position.
I mean, thanks for that, and that's obviously very conscious in the book. I suppose I think that sometimes we're too scared of Christianity, and we're too much into thinking, well, hang on, if we start drawing on Christian thinkers, then maybe we'll find out that we're really Christians after all, and maybe we don't want to be. And I think one of the reasons why there's been so little interest in Shinran in the West is, I think, because readily people assimilate it to a theistic type vision of the world, which to my mind is not correct. But there is, as you just said, there is a vision of the transcendent, and that transcendent is evoked through the myth of Amida and through various symbols, such as the Pure Land. And so in my research for the book, I became quite interested in a number of theologians who focus on the meaning of myth and symbol. To give one example, he's not exactly a theologian, but he was a Catholic. Paul Ricoeur, he wrote quite a lot about symbolism and myth. And one of the things that he argues is that myth is true, but not in a literal way. And myth communicates a truth that cannot be communicated in any other way. So the only way to capture or to engage with the truth that the myth is communicating to us is, first of all, to take the myth seriously, and then to engage in a process of interpreting the myth. But that process of interpretation doesn't result in the idea of thinking, oh, now I've understood what the myth says, and the capacity to explain it in conceptual terms. It's a constant process of returning to the myth, engaging with the myth, and new insights, if you like, emerge through that. So that particular kind of insight was quite important for me in writing the book, which came out in relation to a couple of theologians that I was reading.
I was saying to you recently that with regard to Paul Ricoeur and the idea of the myth, and I was saying, to be honest, even though I've written about the three Pure Land Sutras, I don't really believe that there was such a figure as Dharmakara who spent millions of lifetimes perfecting himself and the Pure Land, and we can be reborn there. I don't really believe that. I can't take that on. And I said I don't really believe the myth, and you countered very. Do you remember what you said in response?
I think I said a couple of things. I said, first of all, myths aren't to be believed in a literal way. And if we do that, we're actually distorting the myths. We're actually misunderstanding them rather than understanding them. But I think I also made use of this idea of entering. So we enter into the myth. It's not like we believe it or not. We enter into the myth. We enter into the world of the myth. And we learn something in that process. And in your book, if I may say, Great Faith, Great Wisdom, you actually enter quite deeply into the dimensions of the Sikhavati Sutras, the visions that appear there, and you try to make some meaningful sense of them. And so I think that's what we're in. But equally, I find that the images themselves have a certain impact. I mean, let's think, for instance, about going back to Amida. As you said, Amida is the infinite. Amida very often is seen in terms of infinite light. So if we think about the vision of infinite light, which is obviously impossible, we can't. But if we begin to think about light that's extending in all directions, what is that like? What does that feel like? You know, it feels really expansive. Light illuminates more than anything. Light banishes the darkness. Light brings light. Light allows us to see things. We can't see the light itself, but through light, we can see everything that reveals itself to us. So there's a lot in terms of the symbolism that we can begin to unfold through engaging with the myth itself, not trying to think that the myth is actually really just a fancy way of talking about something that we can easily talk about in conceptual terms. It isn't that. And I think one of the things that we need to constantly remember with Other Power and the myth of Amida and so on is we're trying to talk about something that is ungraspable, really. And I think if we can constantly remember that, then we'll avoid falling into quite a simplistic, kind of crude way of understanding what it's trying to communicate to us.
That's very interesting because when I first started reading Shinran, it was a shock. It seemed to turn Buddhism on its head. Everything that I thought was Buddhism, he didn't agree with. He was saying, "No, it doesn't work. It doesn't work." Which was, it's well timed for me actually, because I was coming to the end of a 20-year period where I was thinking, "It doesn't work. I'm not changing here." So, you know, and then I came across Shinran. I thought, yes, there's something very important here. So I wonder whether we should go to Shinran now, talk about Shinran a little bit. As you said, monk in, well, he was a monk, but then he became not a monk, didn't he?
Yeah, he actually has the phrase that he consciously used, neither monk nor lay. Maybe that sounds familiar.
It does, it does. And you might have been there. I think you were there when I spoke to Bansi about this. And I was saying that on our tree of refuge and respect, I thought it'd be better to have Tanluan rather than Shinran, because Shinran is so extreme other power, and Tanlan was more like 50-50 self power and other power. And Bansi said, that's not why I put Shinran on the refuge tree. So why did he put him? Because his life was in some striking ways very similar. Shinran, as a monk for 20 years, left that, became neither monk nor lay, did get married and have children. And so very similar in a way to Bante's life, in that he was a monk in India for 20 years and then came back to England. And then he had a whole period where he didn't know whether he was a monk or a layman. He wore layman's clothes most of the time, and occasionally he'd wear his robes. But as he said, the order is neither monk nor lay, neither monastic nor lay.
And I think one thing that we can add to that, add to those parallels, is the way in which Shinran began to share an approach to Dharma practice that everybody could follow. So even at the time of Shinran, Buddhism was largely still elitist. He himself, as you said, was a Tendai monk. So he lived on Mount Hiei, which is outside Kyoto. And the Tendai approach is very, very studious. You have to study a huge number of texts and practices in order to engage with that tradition. And well, in the Japan at that time, most people couldn't even read. Most people did not have the possibility of engaging in Buddhism in the way that Shinran could. So one of his convictions was to offer a vision of Dharma practice that anybody could follow. And so after his exile, he was exiled from Kyoto for apparently criticizing establishment Buddhism. Quite interesting parallel as well, isn't it? And he went to some more remote areas of Japan and slowly began to share his new vision of the Dharma, which basically focused on the recitation of the Nimbutsu, Namo Amida Butsu. And actually the sanghas that he initiated turned out then to become the biggest school in Japan. Today, it's still the biggest school in Japan. The schools that trace themselves back to Shinran. And I would say that rather than a lay form of practice, I would say that it's kind of a transcendence of the distinction between monk and lay in a similar way that Bante's approach to or Dharmacharya and Dharmacharya ordination transcends that.
Yes, I was going to say, but the practice in Jōdo Shinshū is much easier than some of the things that we do. But then I thought, wait a minute, it's probably much harder as well, because which brings us on to the fourth part of your title, Other Power. So I think most people watching this will have an idea what other power is. They would have heard Sangharakshita talk about it in one of his lectures. And he's on the Shinran's on the tree of refuge and respect, so reverence and respect, I should say. So people have probably know a little bit about other power, but what is it?
I mean, I think that's a really interesting question, and I knew that you were going to ask me this, and I wanted to answer, I don't know, is my first genuine response. But I think there's a lot of things that we can say about other power. I think the first thing that I would like to say is other power is trying to capture the insight or the awareness that there are influences, beneficial influences and forces that are beyond what we know, that are beyond the known self, as I've said before, that we can actually become receptive to in the course of our Dharma lives. So very easily, I think we can adopt the idea of Buddhist practice that it's about me, I do it, it's about my will, I apply my will, I practice, I make progress, and hopefully in some future, I will become enlightened. So it becomes a kind of very self-referential process. Not only that, but we think that we are the person, we are the one with all of the resources, if you like, we are the one where it all comes from. But if we think, for instance, about any of us here, if we think about our first contact with Buddhism, why did we even make that contact in the first place? And why did we stick around? When I first made contact with Buddhism, I was actually 18, the first time. And I had a lot of friends who were kind of interested in Buddhism, but none of them really picked up on it in a deep way. Why did I? And I don't think it was because there was anything particularly special about me. One way of talking about it would be because I liked it, because I needed it, because I engaged with it. But I think another way of talking about it would be to say that something responded to the Dharma through me that is not me. And I think that continues to be the case. For instance, if we think about going for refuge, which is the primary way that we talk about Dharma life, Buddhist practice, who is it that goes for refuge? Is it me, or is it something that comes through me? And if we're talking about something that comes through me, well, we could think about that as other power. Just to go a little bit further, Ratnaguna. So we touched on at the beginning of the interview about the fact that my first contact with Shinran was actually through a study dialogue that you and I did, and we talked about this the other day. And we were in the library at this place called Dharmavastu at the time, and Ratnaguna, we were sat down on the chairs there, and Ratnaguna, you were taking me through the Shoshinge. And one of the things that you said is something like, what Shinran says is that we can't become enlightened through our own efforts, something along those lines. And it might be that one might hear that statement and feel quite discouraged because we might be quite convinced that, well, we're on the path to enlightenment and probably with a few more years, we'll definitely get there. But for me, when you said that, I felt this immense relief because I knew I couldn't get enlightened, at least not by my own efforts. So it's actually an immense relief to hear a respected Buddhist, if you like, saying that. And rather than that being the end of the story, if you like, that was the beginning of the story. Because if I can't get enlightenment through my own efforts, how does it all work then? What is actually going on in the Dharma life? And then that invites the possibility of a different kind of language, such as the language of other power, to talk about what Dharma practice consists in and how it functions.
Mm. Mm. Yes. Just thinking about the language we use coming from Sangharakshita in our own movement, you've got the five niyamas. And the two important ones for us in terms of practice is the karma niyama and the dharma niyama. The karma means action, as we know. So it's the karma niyama is when you're actually doing the spiritual life. You're getting up in the morning, meditating, etc., etc. You're doing it. But then you also have to allow the dharma niyama in. The dharma niyama is something like the force or spirit, things that we cannot see or hear, which is actually, if we open up to, can help us to get there. And I've realized recently I have a firm conviction that other power, dharma niyama, actually exists out there. And up until a few months ago, I would be saying to myself, come on, Ratnaguna, get down to it. You must meditate. Come on. And I do it sort of dutifully, but nothing happens. And I know you're not supposed to wait for nothing to happen, but after 45 years, you kind of expect something. So in January, I decided to do a solitary retreat, and I'd read the original manuscript of your book, and I was so inspired. And I just thought, why don't you just do it? Why don't you just give up to other power and see? And my meditation has become much richer and enjoyable. I used to be puzzled when people used to meditate and they go, oh, I love that. And I think, how did you do that? I have no idea. So I came to the conclusion, somewhat like Shinran, I guess, that I cannot do self-power practices. They seem to be beyond me. They become too conceptual. I'm thinking of metta, I'm thinking of the breath and so on. I don't seem to be able to get out of that. But if I just allow Amitabha's grace waves, his compassion and wisdom to come down on me, I seem to, well, I do, I get a lot more out of it. And you must have a firm belief too.
I don't believe it, no. A phrase that I use in the book is concerning to find yourself in a new horizon of meaning, where different things make sense to you. So beliefs, when we talk about beliefs, they seem to me to suggest some kind of conceptual or cognitive assent. But when you have a conviction or you see things in a different way, it's not that you believe that. That's just how you are in the world, if you like. So I think probably what I would say is that the horizon of meaning within which I live and exist is one where other power is meaningful and present, rather than the fact that I believe in other power.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Oh, very interesting. I wonder whether we should bring Dayamati onto the stage, drag him up, kicking and screaming, perhaps. Dayamati?
Hello.
Oh, where's he gone? There we are. Welcome. I've never met you before, Dayamati. I don't think I've ever seen you before, but it's really good to meet you. I've heard a lot of very good things from Nagapriya.
And likewise, I'm very happy to meet you. Nagapriya and I studied your book with great interest and benefit for me at least, and I'm sure for Nagapriya as well. So thank you for that book.
You're welcome. I just want to introduce another topic now. I think we should talk about shinjin.
Okay.
Dayamati, would you like to tell us about shinjin?
Yeah, Actually, I find that one of the most mysterious and yet very enriching concepts in all of Shinran. And it seems to be a condition whereby, I mean, Shinran himself identifies it in some ways with Buddha nature, with tatata, and so we have this kind of sense of it being the fulfillment already. And Nagapriya talks about this in a very beautiful way, that there's a promise of something in the future, but by participating in that promise, by taking it seriously, it's already been fulfilled through shinjin.
Yes. Nagapriya, shinjin.
Yeah, well, so in ordinary accounts of Pure Land Buddhism, it is common to render shinjin as faith, true faith, which I think is not very useful or helpful as a translation, really. So in terms of thinking about what shinjin is gesturing towards, Bhante, in one of his essays, links it to the idea of real going for refuge, as you know. But thinking sort of more existentially, if you like, about what shinjin seems to gesture at, ideas for me like letting through or letting go are concerned with what shinjin is about. But what I'd also say, kind of continuing from what Dayamati said, quite often when we think about things that we conceptualize as possible experiences, we think that they're things that will happen to us in the future, or maybe that have happened to us in the past. So in other words, we might experience shinjin, we might think in those terms, or we might think that we've already experienced shinjin, and shinjin is kind of there in our pocket or in our bag ready to call on. And the way that I often talk about it is that shinjin is always in the process of emerging right now. So it's something that we can be opening out into in this moment. It's not something that becomes finished or complete. So there's a way in which we've already realized it, but there's also a way in which we will never fully realize it, because it's something that's emerging in the moment, and it doesn't become a past fact to be looked back on.
Yes, now you've reminded me of this really great idea, well, a great insight, that when you experience shinjin, you feel the wisdom and compassion coming from Amida, and at the same time, you realize how deeply, deeply foolish you are. And the way I understand that is that you wouldn't be able to see the depth of your foolishness without Amitabha's love coming down on you. It's quite interesting in the near-death experiences. One of the common things that happen to people is they see their past life, the whole life going through, probably within seconds. And they first of all apparently see all the bad things that they've done. But they're able to do that because they feel a very strong compassion. A being is around that's beaming compassion onto them, and that allows them to go and see all the bad things they've done. Then the next thing they see all the good things they've done. And I think that's that idea that the wisdom and compassion of Amitabha coming down on you, and at the same time seeing how awful you've been for so many lifetimes, is an incredible insight, isn't it?
I think is one of the really radical insights that Shinran puts forward. Because when we normally think about the Buddhist path and we conceptualize enlightenment, it seems to me that in some way we conceptualize it as a progress towards perfection, certainly a progress towards moral perfection and wisdom. And we think that there are increments of it. And so we'll get gradually closer to this goal, and one day we'll be there, or we'll arrive there. Whereas it seems to me that the radical insight of Shinran is that there is a dual awareness, or there are various dimensions to Shinjin, to the awakening moment. And one of them is this connection to the transcendent, this connection to other power, which brings about a sense of joy and a sense of gratitude and a sense of meaningfulness and connection, because we, according to Shinran, have been perpetually or eternally gifted the Buddha's mind, Amida's mind. We're in contact with the Buddha's mind.
Yes.
How wonderful is that? And we didn't do anything to deserve it either.
Yes.
It's just a gift. But at the very same moment, while we're waking up to that, we're also, as you were hinting at, seeing more and more deeply into our own samskaras, into our own negative habit patterns, into the ways that we're unkind to other people, into the ways that we're selfish. And there's this sort of perpetual dialectic, you could say, between those two dimensions, the dimension of constantly being affirmed and connecting with the compassion, wisdom, but at the same time constantly waking up in a deeper and deeper way to our own failings. And so with the aspect of the failings part of it, what that brings about is more than anything, humility, an attitude of humility in relation to one's own shortcomings, but also a desire not to harm others through our actions. And another aspect of it would be a patience in relation to others, because if we really see deeply into how flawed and limited we are, we will also start to recognize that other people are just like that too. And so if we're constantly acting in ways that are less than perfect, how could we constantly expect that others will act in a perfect way? So the recognition of our own limits or our own boundedness can inspire greater patience and compassion towards others.
My goodness, amazing. There's a phrase that I've read in a few of Shinran's works, translated into English, of course, and the phrase is of change of heart. And when I first read that, I thought, gosh, a change of heart, because very often we conceptualize the insight process in terms of insight, but it's also in terms of knowledge. You realize that you don't really have a self after all, whatever. But in the Pure Land tradition, it's a change of heart. And we know that a change of heart is a deep change, don't we? You know, nothing else might have changed, but this person decided to do something quite different than they were going to do. But that phrase, a change of heart, doesn't suggest any kind of cognitive element. What do you think of that, Diane, Matty? You're muted, by the way.
Yes, thank you for reminding me that I was I was muted. Yes, the change of heart sounds very much like the Christian notion of metanoia, which is often translated as conversion.
Yes.
And there's, I think, a great similarity here with the shinjin, as we were talking earlier, in that there seems to be a phase. I mean, I've known a good many people who were born into a Jōdo Shinshū family in Japan. And several of them have talked about a period of their life where they go along with the program because that's what the family does. They go to temple, they do various things, they attend all the death ceremonies, and they're quite familiar with the story, but there comes a point at which it really takes hold. And it's not necessarily a matter of belief or a change in cognition, but simply, as Nagapriya was saying, participating in the story, taking it seriously as a story.
You mentioned metanoia, and you related it to the Christian tradition, but it's also a word used in the ancient Greek philosophies, isn't it, too? Metanoia is a deep change, a turning about, yeah. I have a feeling that we should stop pretty soon because, you know, to give other people a chance to ask questions, say something. Is there anything you want to say to end, Nagapriya? Any last thing that you would have liked us to go into?
I think it's okay for the moment. We could just see what questions arise.
Okay. I want to thank Dayamati for two things. Thanks for coming in, for being dragged into the spotlight like you did, but also thank you for studying the complete works of Shinran with Nagapriya over a period of 6 months. So you're a big part of this book, aren't you? Yes,
Well, I would like to thank Nagapriya for suggesting that study to me, and as I think I've told him before, there was a period in my life when I was not at all interested in Shinran. I think I had much the same attitude that you did, that it just seemed like it was not Buddhism. Right? It was just nothing that I could identify as being Buddhist in it. I did still have that attitude when I began reading this with Nagapriya, but I got so much out of it through Nagapriya's comments and his questions in our discussion that I never would have gotten out of it. So as I've said to him, for me, one of the meanings of other power is all of the things that we get through the rest of the world, through the universe, making it possible for us to understand things. And I certainly benefited tremendously from these discussions with Nagapriya. So thank you, Nagapriya.
thank you again, Dayamati. So yes, we'll stop the conversation there and see if there are any questions or comments anyone would like to make.
So thank you both. We've got one question so far. I've got a few questions, and if you've got thoughts or questions, now's a good time to write them into the chat box, either to me directly or to everyone. But we can start with a great question from Claudia. She says, I have a question. I find the concept of other power very inspiring, and I really like the idea of drawing inspiration and aspiration through it. However, I wonder, how can one open up to it in practical terms? How does it look in a tangible way to be receptive to Amida's love and compassion?
Do you want to start, Ratnaguna, or do you want me to start?
I'd like you to start, please.
I mean, my first response is that you can't do that because that would be to make use of self-power. And it's partly about recognizing that you are already open to that. It's not something that you need to become open to. You already are. So you can pay attention to that reality. But I think the other thing that I would say is to sort of link things a bit more to our system of practice, if you like, our vision of practice. Devotional practices are very relevant. The puja, according to Bhante and tradition, the function of the sevenfold puja is to give rise to the bodhicitta. And the bodhicitta is another way of talking about other power. So I'm hopefully answering your question right now, Parami. But she's asking me, where is the bodhicitta? Well, I think I'd give a Bhante type response to that. If we ask where is the bodhicitta, it suggests that the bodhicitta is an object that can be located in space. The bodhicitta is a way of talking about a volition or an impulse that can arise through us that doesn't belong to the ego. That can be readily linked to the idea of other power. And one of the primary ways to engage with that is through puja. I think doing other devotional practices like mantra chanting, prostrations, and so on are really helpful. But perhaps to be a bit more radical in my response, the other way of doing it would be to forget the idea that your practice is going to achieve anything and just do it anyway and see what happens when you do that.
I'll just say a little bit. because as we know, Shinran was extreme other power. Any self-power practice was an expression of doubt in other power for him. But I haven't got there yet. And he does have a fallback position, doesn't he, for people like me who are very inspired by other power, but can't get to the point where I can do nothing. I feel I need to somehow do something. And so he's got this idea of self-power within other power, or it might be the other way around. I can't how he puts it, but you can do self-power, but within the context of other power, you're just trying to get ready for the day when you can completely open yourself up to other power.
Yeah, I mean, just to add a little bit more, Ratnaguna, I guess remembering those two dimensions of the shinjin vision, if you like, which is on the one hand, recognizing that there is an enlightened beneficial influence that wants to reach out and that oneself is limited. I mean, I don't seem to be able to avoid constantly reflecting on my own limitations. It readily presents itself to me. So the idea of thinking that I could still actually get enlightened by my own efforts isn't somewhere I can really go in terms of my way of seeing things. So I don't really have any choice, I guess, is another way of putting that. And you can. I'm not, by the way, arguing against the value of practice. I think we should practice, but I think it's very, very interesting when we're doing any kind of practice like meditating or puja to ask ourselves, why are we doing it? What is it for? And what we can sometimes discover is that we're bargaining. So we're bargaining. So we're saying, okay, I will do 100,000 prostrations, and for that I deserve a certain level of spiritual attainment. Returning to your distinction earlier between the karma niyama and the dhamma niyama, they are discontinuous. So no amount of karmic effort is going to give rise to the dhamma niyama. There has to be a shift, and that shift doesn't come about simply through putting in more self-power effort. So there's a bit of a paradox to reflect on there.
I've got another question that's come in. Well, you might have seen there's a question from Bridget about who would like to know more about your meditation practice, Nagapriya. And you've already spoken a little bit about the idea of practice. Yeah.
Okay. So you put me on the spot there, haven't you? Well, there's actually a whole chapter in the book that addresses the question of practice. And in that particular chapter, I actually do quite a lot of linking between Shinran's vision of practice and Dogen. And one of the things that Dogen says is that we enact awakening through practice. We enact it. So practice doesn't have an instrumental function in the sense of taking us somewhere in the future. Practice itself reveals the goal in itself. So there's something, but that engages me. So if you take that as a kind of framing vision for your practice, then there's quite a lot to think about there. I think the other thing that I would add to that about practice, particularly when I'm doing, say, a practice like the Nimbutsu chanting, could be any mantra, actually. It doesn't have to be Amitabha's mantra. But I chant it not thinking that I'm going to gain something through doing it. I chant it because I want to, and also out of a sense of gratitude for all that I've received. So those are some of the ways in which I think about practice. How about you, Ratnaguna? Any thoughts on that?
Me? No, not really. I know the person who asked the question very well, so she knows what the answer would be.
We've got an interesting thread developing here, but before we go on to that, I'd like to apologize to Claudio, not Claudia. Sorry for that. There's a follow-up question from Maria Teresa who says, so would be like make an effort practice, but have faith in the power that is already in us. So we need to let it act through us. It raises, for me, it's so interesting to think about what is self and other in that question. I wonder if you can help pick that apart a little bit.
Yeah, well, maybe I could just briefly touch on the idea of effort to start with that question, because I think our normal way of thinking about what effort is that we, as some kind of discrete individual, make some kind of decision and puts energy into something, and that's what effort is. But I think an interesting question could be, where does our impulse to practice come from, and who does it belong to? Does it belong to us? Does it come from us? Or does it seem to come from somewhere that is beyond what we normally understand ourselves to be? And so I think if we then start thinking in that way, then we start gesturing towards other power and recognizing that effort isn't necessarily a product of the self, if you like, or a product of the mundane self. So that's my thought. Maybe Ratnaguna's got a different observation.
Not really.
It reminds me a little bit of what you said earlier, which really struck me, was you said something when you're talking about going for refuge, you said something that comes through me goes for refuge, rather than sort of I go for refuge. And it brings us to, we've got two questions that I think are related. So if you don't mind, I'll just read them both and see what they come to. So Sangajit's asked a question on everyone, which says, is there any direct links here in terms of how we think of our own ordination? So that's one part. And then Chandradeepa and Stephen have asked a question which says, Stephen or Stefan, I'm not sure which, Shinran's teaching can sound so different to how Bhante talks about the Dharma life. How has it been for you to integrate these two seemingly different approaches? Sorry, that was from Chandradeepa.
That's great. So I'm more interested in taking that second question, if I can, because I think a number of people have said similar things to me about that. And I think it's almost like become an accepted fact that other power or the other power vision is quite alien to us, or our vision of practice in Triratna. But I think all the opposite, actually. And the more closely that I read Bhante and read various things that he's written, I see more and more gestures towards another power type vision. To give a couple of examples, or one example anyway, Subhuti wrote an essay some years ago called a Suprapersonal Force that speaks through me or emerges through me. And that refers to a moment in Bhante's life after the death of Dr. Ambedkar in 1956, when Bhante was en route from Kalimpong. I think he was going to Calcutta, not sure. But anyway, he ended up going to Nagpur in order to console Dr. Ambedkar's followers. And during the course of a day, I think he gave like 14 talks or something like that in different neighborhoods. And he said, and he spoke about it as though there were a suprapersonal force working through him. And you might also remember in various places where Bhante talks about the founding of the order itself, he talks about the order being founded through him rather than him founding the order. So I think there are a couple of examples where it seems to me that Bhante was very attentive to the fact that the things that have emerged in his Dharma life are not just to do with his ordinary will, if you like, that he was in touch with influences that went beyond his ordinary self. So yeah, and there's a lot more that I could say, but there's just a couple of examples of it. We could even think, let's mention it as well, Bhante's very first encounter with a Buddhist text, where he talks about, he reads the Diamond Sutra, he reads the Sutra of Huineng, and he realizes that he was a Buddhist and he always had been. So we're talking about something that transcends time, something that transcends our ordinary notions of what understanding is, what transformation is. And I find in that another very mysterious reference to something beyond the known self.
Can I answer the first question about ordination? Can you just read it out again for me?
Sangajit says, is there any direct links here in terms of how we think about our ordination? And I think that question was being typed when we were talking about the notion of practice or effort or progress.
Yes, well, I think there is a definite connection. And I'd like to go back to an early text from the Pali Canon that concerns an old and sick man called Nagapriya. And he goes to see the Buddha. He's a lay follower and a much loved lay follower. And he says, look, I'm really old, I'm sick, I'm in pain. What can I do? What can I practice? And the Buddha's answer to him is so simple. You have to say to yourself over and over again, my body is afflicted, but my mind is not afflicted. That's the simple teaching. But then they part company. And Nagapriya goes to see his friend Sariputta. And Sariputta sees Nagapriya coming in the distance, and he says, wow, look at you, you're so golden. Back to golden again. You're radiant. He said, has the Buddha been teaching you? And Nagapriya's answer is extraordinary. He doesn't say, yes, he's been teaching me. He says, yes, he has just sprinkled me with the deathless. Sprinkled me with the deathless, or consecrated me with the deathless. Deathless being Amrita in Sanskrit. Is it Amrita in Pali? I can't remember, but if it is, it's a nice connection with Amitabha. So where that comes in the ordination, I think, is at a certain point, your preceptor is in front of you and he asks you to bow, and he has the vase of initiation, and he or she pours the water, which is supposed to be the nectar of Amrita, of the deathless, pours it onto your head so that it goes right in you like that. And I think that's what the ordination is really about. It's being initiated into the deathless. And when order members are teaching, we're trying to get that deathless that should have come in through our head at the top there and percolated our body, trying to share that with everybody else. We're trying to sprinkle or consecrate the deathless over everybody.
That's great, Ratnaguna. I just want to add to that as well, and to remind us that the initiation vase is considered to be a bodhisattva.
Gosh, never heard that.
So that through receiving the drops of water on our head from the bodhisattva, we are actually receiving that bodhisattva's adhisthana, which is blessing. And just by the way, now it's emerging, we could think of adhisthana as a very close parallel to the concept of other power. So adhisthana is the blessing of the enlightened mind, or the blessing of the bodhisattvas that we can open ourselves up to.
We've got a comment from Priyavadita, which follows quite nicely from this. So it's a few paragraphs, so let me read it out to you. Of late it occurs to me, this is Priyavadita writing, that the Dharma life is a co-creational process. The notion that I am practicing does not encompass what's going on. Through my years/decades rattling around with Triratna, whilst often the process has been painful and taken me in some really unexpected directions, I would not be me with my engagement with Shinran without this context and the way all the people in it and our interactions created me. It was not something that I did, as far as I can make out. Seems like other power is everything, everywhere, really. It's a matter of how you relate to what's going on. If you think about Buddha nature, you can think it's something you contain. But Garbha also means womb. It contains us. The spiritual life from this perspective is not something you possess. It possesses you. Letting this happen is presumably what Shinjin is gesturing at. discussed.
Well, that's really good, isn't it?
That's absolutely brilliant, Priyavadita. Thanks for that. I mean, a couple of things that occur to me in terms of responding to your response. In one way, you're talking about the Sangha, I guess, at least in the immediate instance. And I think that's another obvious way that we can articulate what other power is. Other power may be the Sangha, and the way in which participating in Sangha enables us to give birth to a volition to go for refuge that doesn't just come from us, it's actually co-created. I like that term that you used. And the other thought that occurred to me about it is that for me, the vision, or what other power is partly gesturing towards is recognizing or asking the question, what is will and where does it come from and who does it belong to? So if we have the will to go for refuge, whose will is that? We might say, well, it's my will, but what does that even mean? It's just a way of talking, really. Yeah, and the other thing that I wanted to mention was the Bante's vision of the order as a thousand-armed Avalokiteshvara. So we individually are not the Bodhisattva. We form the Bodhisattva together. We co-create the Bodhisattva, if you like. Or the Bodhisattva emerges through us as a community, not through us as an individual. And I find that, well, constantly I return to that. And again, I think that's another way of gesturing towards other power and the influence or the impact of the order in the world can be lived and experienced by others as other power. They will be influenced by it. It will enter into their lives as it enters into our lives and transform their lives. And that isn't just down to oneself, that's down to other people making an effort to reach out to us. It's really quite exciting to think about the possibility that there are people out there who really want to help us, people who are in some way influenced by or guided by the bodhicitta. If it wasn't for that, I certainly would be completely lost. Do you have any thoughts about it, Ratnaguna?
No, I've just been thinking on a bit. It's getting a bit late for me because my mind is beginning to drift. But I thought before I leave, I just want to say that I noticed yesterday that on the Windhorse Publications website, when it's advertising Nagapriya's new book, it also says if you buy it now, you can get 40% from off his other two books. So I just want to mention them. There's this one written quite some time ago. In fact, you wrote this when we were at Vajrakuta together, didn't you? Or Dhammavastu together, yeah. This is a really good book. David Loy says every Buddhist should read it. So if you haven't read it, you have to then, don't you? You should read it. The other one, this is a lovely, lovely book. Beautiful book. Unfortunately, really neglected. I don't understand it because it's so beautifully written and it's gorgeous. It's called Visions of Mahayana Buddhism. And then the subtitle is Awakening the Universe to Wisdom and Compassion. Really is a lovely book. And I sometimes wonder whether maybe people haven't bought it because they've already read Paul Williams' famous book on the Mahayana. This is actually quite different. Paul Williams writes a lot about the Indo-Tibetan tradition. And while Nagapriya does write about that, he also writes about the Far Eastern tradition, China, Korea, Japan, and so on. It's really beautifully written and really fascinating book. So I would go for that offer if I were you. I would buy this new book, which has to be read, and get this one as well, 40% off.
We didn't even pay you to do that, Ratnaguna. Thank you. I wonder if we are coming to the end of our conversation, and I've been really appreciative of the flow of the conversation and the ways in which the comments and the questions have explored a little bit further in some of these areas. There is so much to explore in this book. The book contains, in a way, a lot more than we've talked about today, or it also gives a lot more detail in a lot of the sections. It opens up a lot of other questions for reflection. So I hope that you will continue on to read the book in some fullness. And I wondered if there was anything, Nagapriya. Well, let's start with you, Ratnaguna. Is there anything else that you'd like to say? And then we'll give Nagapriya, as great author, the final word.
I'm one of those people who, after I've done something, I just see the faults. And I think, oh, why didn't I say that? So I really wish I'd have asked Nagapriya something about the hermeneutics and uh, the text as a portal to the infinite. Is some beautiful sections near the beginning about the power of a text. The text isn't just something you sort of read and learn. It actually, if you engage with it, it can take you into the infinite. Well, I suppose back to Amrita, isn't it? The deathless. I really wish I'd have done that, but you can't do everything, I suppose.
Well, you might have done it now, Ratnaguna. So let's see.
Well, you touched on it. I mean, I can't address all the things that you just mentioned, but I was thinking about introducing a sort of hermeneutic reflection, if you like.
Yes.
And what I wanted to say was, we can easily fall into the trap of thinking that one day we will understand. And we fall into the trap of thinking that there will be a future when we have fully captured what it is that we're trying to capture. And I would like to say that that is a trap, and that's an error in our thinking, and actually can often end up being some kind of cul-de-sac. And one of the insights, if you like, from philosophical hermeneutics, which is like the interpretation of cultural material, is that understanding is never finished. So you never come to an end of your understanding. It's always a process. So in the course of a conversation like this, we might have some insights, we might touch certain things, but that's not the end of the matter. And the next time we can begin again and have some fresh insights or a new angle on the old insights. So I think what I'm trying to drive at is that if you're going away from this conversation thinking, I'm not sure yet that I quite grasp what other power is, or what shinjin is, or what Nagapriya is talking about, that strikes me as actually a positive starting point for continued reflection rather than a problem.
Yes, as I've said to you before, Nagapriya, when I was reading your book, it's funny, you said to Dhammamegha in the podcast that it was like you were on the very edge of your understanding as you were reading it. It really comes across like that. Such fresh ideas, as if they'd just been cooked by you there and then. You know, you almost as if you hadn't thought them before, but they're occurring to you as you write the book. And so many times I just stopped reading. I thought, I have to stop now because that was so good, and I just need to close my eyes and let it in, kind of thing. Beautifully done.
Thank you both, and thank you everyone for being here this evening. I think this is not the last we'll hear from more about this book and what it raises. So I really appreciate the many years of thoughtful exploration that's so obviously gone into this.